Good evening, everyone. For those of you I have not yet met, I'm John Stewart Gordon. I'm the Associate Curator of American Decorative Arts here at the Art Gallery. And on behalf of our director, Stephanie Wiles, and the head of our board, Carol LeWitt, I'm thrilled to welcome you all to the 2019 Oswaldo Rodriguez Roque Memorial Lecture. Before we get going, I just would like to give you an opportunity to silence your cell phones. You were going to do it anyway, but and if you can get reception down in our underground auditorium, I'm really impressed, but don't show off. I've also been asked to let you know that in addition to the door in which you entered, there are 2 more exits on the other side of the auditorium. I hope we won't need them, but they're there in case you get so overwhelmed by the glass that you need some air. So welcome to the Roque Memorial Lecture. Tonight's lecture serves as the keynote for the Symposium, Stories in American Glass, New Scholarship, New Perspectives. The Symposium, in turn, celebrates the gallery's latest student-curated exhibition, A Nation Reflected, Stories in American Glass. This project emerged out of an undergraduate seminar that I taught last fall, and I was lucky to have 6 really talented students: Julia Karabatsos, Nolan Crawford, Lily Dodd, Adelaide Goodyear, Mariana Mellon-Corcoran, and Jocelyn Wickersham, as well as Alexandra Ward, our Marcia Brady Tucker Fellow in the Department of American Decorative Arts. A number of the student curators are here this evening, and I'd like them to identify themselves so we can publicly embarrass you and congratulate you. So. They have put in so much hard work, and it is so appropriate tonight that we are opening this symposium and this exhibition with the Oswaldo Rodriguez Roque Memorial Lecture, because Oswaldo once stood in the same place you are. He graduated from Yale College in 1972. He got his master's degree from Yale in 1975. He then went on to work as an associate curator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art before he became the inaugural executive director of the Chipstone Foundation in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Following his early death in 1989, a lectureship was created in his memory through a gift from Chipstone Foundation and contributions from his friends, colleagues, and family. And over the years, we've been really fortunate to have his friends and family come to these lectures, and tonight is no exception, so welcome. Our keynote lecturer tonight is Kelly Conway, Curator of American Glass at the Corning Museum of Glass. Kelly received a BA from DePaul University in Greencastle, Indiana, and a master's degree from the Parsons School of Design and the Smithsonian Associates Program in Washington, D.C. Her master's thesis was on the art glass of the Union Glass Company of Somerville, Massachusetts, and her passion for the material led to her being named the Carolyn and Richard Berry Curator of Glass at the Chrysler Museum in Norfolk, Virginia. There, she reinstalled their expansive collections of glass and helped establish a glass-blowing studio on the museum's campus. In 2013, she headed north to Corning, where, among other projects, she reinstalled the museum's Crystal City galleries to commemorate the 150th anniversary of glassworking in Corning, and she partnered with the Neustadt collection of Tiffany glass to mount the luminous and illuminating exhibition, Tiffany's Glass Mosaics. And that's only one of many glass puns you're going to hear this few days. Kelly and I had met in passing over the years, but we really bonded during a sultry summer night in New Orleans. I was just beginning my research on American glass and tentatively shared some of my thoughts with her. I was really worried that she would dismiss my expansive approach, and instead, she became really excited, and we spent the rest of the evening talking about Coke bottles and light bulbs and all the wonderful and overlooked areas of scholarship, much to the amusement of our third dinner companion, who spent the entire evening just sitting watching us talk. I still apologize to him to this day. Thus, when it came time to find a keynote speaker for a symposium that explored new research and new ways of thinking about glass, Kelly was the natural choice. After Kelly's presentation, there will be a reception in the Jan and Frederick Mayer lobby. Our incredible editors and installation crew have been working in overdrive to get our exhibition ready, and we are pleased to offer a sneak preview this evening. The exhibition is on the 4th floor of our Louis Kahn building, accessible via the elevator right off of the lobby. As I mentioned, it is a sneak preview. I think all of those wonderful little finishing touches will be done between 8 and 10 tomorrow morning. So bear with us. So with all of those caveats and accolades aside, I welcome Kelly Conway to the podium to ask, what is the future for American glass?
Good evening. How are all you? How are you? I've flocked here from Florida from a glass conference, if you can believe it. So just because this is such a special lecture to give and such a special invitation from John and the Yale University Art Gallery, and I just really want to thank John and everyone on staff here for inviting me to put this new lecture together and to think about Corning's collection in a slightly different way. So thank you. In 1941, the father-daughter team of George and Helen McKiernan published the book American Glass, a monumental work of 621 pages with about 1,000 illustrations and another 1,000 line drawings. The book sold through multiple editions with tens of thousands of copies produced, and it made the New York Times or the New York Tribune's bestseller list for nonfiction. Notifications for the book appeared in newspapers all over the country, from Vermont, the McKierans' home base, to Texas and California. Additionally, newspapers commented on and advertised auxiliary lectures by the authors. Clearly, a passionate interest in historical American glass was stoked by this volume, and the McKierans acted as consultants for many auction houses, antiques dealers, private collectors, and museum curators over the course of the 20th century. What they created was a legacy that still stands today and what forms our foundation for moving forward in the 21st century. In a letter to archaeologist Harry Hall White, dated about June 7th, 1941, George McKiernan anticipates White's reaction to this new publication. McKiernan writes, quote, "Of course, I know a large percentage of the attributions that collectors and dealers are prone to make cannot be accepted as correct on the basis of data and information on which they are predicated. I suppose you will severely criticize our book with respect to many of the attributions in connection with pieces illustrated, but we have endeavored to make it very clear that most attributions with respect to American glass, unless based on authentic documentary evidence or on definite evidence, such as your excavations, supplemented with contributing evidence, are largely a matter of speculation." Helen McKiernan, George's daughter and co-author of the book, once stated to a person who referred to the book as the Bible. She said, verbatim, "Well, like the Bible, it's full of myths and mistakes." That was actually told to me anecdotally by Dwight Landman, the former director of the Corning Museum of Glass and Winterthur Museum. Whether or not that's precisely what Helen McKiernan stated, the story Dwight shared revealed two things to me. The obvious being that a heavy reliance on a single published source of information has outsized and continuing impact on our current understanding of American glass. The other was how knowledge and an inspired passion for the study of American glass is passed from generation to generation. Listening to Dwight talk about his admiration for Helen McKiernan echoed my own experience as a young scholar, and I hope it's a similar experience you all have had in this project. What I would like to think McKiernan was saying in her comment about the book's influence was that there is so much more work to do. More to know and to understand, and that this generational collegial exchange is a key contributor to getting that work accomplished. It's why we've gathered here. My charge, as mandated by John, was to provoke some conversation around the subject of American glass today. So I'll probably pose more questions than give you answers. So rather than spend time on the interpretive or narrative directions American glass should go, I'm actually going to spend most of my time assessing the state of our current museum collections from the back end, if you will, putting in particular the Corning Museum of Glass under the microscope. The foundation for the scope of collections and the correlating information articulated in most of our museum databases really begins in the early 20th century. Prior to the publication of American Glass and its follow-up popular volume, 200 Years of Blown Glass by the McCarrans in 1950, there was already a groundswell of activity in the late 1920s and 30s surrounding the collecting, exhibiting, and publishing of American glass history. And some examples I'll highlight for you this evening. They include Rhea Mansfield Niddle published her volume, Early American Glass, in 1927, and it's so beautifully detailed in John's introductory essay in Yale's new catalog. In 1929, George McCarran lent 500 objects to the Girl Scout Loan Exhibition at the American Art Association at the Anderson Galleries in New York City. Ultimately, the Corning Museum of Glass purchased about 1,600 pieces from the McCarrans over a period of time from 1950 to 1964. And recent research by Alexandra Rogero, the museum's assistant curator of modern glass, has helped us identify objects in Corning's collection, which we believe were displayed in this 1929 exhibition. In the 1920s and 30s, archaeologist Harry Hall White was traveling across the Northeast, the Midwest, and the Mid-Atlantic states, working with the locals and the communities on excavations of 17th, 18th, and 19th century glassmaking sites. His extensive archives were recently acquired by the Roque Research Library at the Corning Museum of Glass, and they're ready to be dived into. In 1931, Ruth Webb Lee publishes Early American Press Glass. In this article, you can see that it's in its 8th printing over the course of a decade. Our story of American glass is usually very Northeast and Midwest-centric, but there was a concentrated interest occurring in the South as well. In 1931, there was a great deal of publicity surrounding the excavation of the first glass-making attempts at Jamestown, Virginia, in the 17th century. 2 years later, in 1933, an exhibition of American glass was held in Richmond, Virginia. So don't forget, this was also the period when John D. Rockefeller Jr. is restoring Colonial Williamsburg, just down the road from both of these glass endeavors. The founding of the National Early American Glass Club also occurred in 1933, an organization that has been influencing collectors and scholars for decades, and I see several members of that club in the room tonight. The club organized exhibitions, with the first held in 1933, and they also sponsored field trips to major museums and historical sites. Here they are at the Bennington Museum. They published the Bulletin, and here you see a review of the club's presentation on Boston-based WHDH-TV. Here you have members of the club, along with Victor Lutz, the son of Nicholas Lutz, the glassmaker, who introduced the club's exhibition on view at the Boston Public Library that year. And it was certainly a pioneering program for being broadcast in color. Imagine that with all the glass. The Bulletin became one of the leading forums for publishing active scholarship over the next several decades. Here we see Ken Wilson, who was chairman of the Identification Committee, addressing the club on the subject of Mount Washington glass and its successors, and a summary of his lecture was published in the Bulletin. It took Wilson another 40 years to finalize and publish his full 2 volumes on the expansive production of this company, with the second volume having to be completed posthumously by Jane Spillman, who was the curator of American glass before I was at the Corning Museum. Jane, as you see here, a young Jane, joined the Corning Museum in 1965, and she retired from the museum in 2013 after being there for 48 years. We see her here authoring articles for the Bulletin, noteworthy since she was the first to clearly document her sources in the Bulletin, and thus elevating its level of scholarship. Jane also served as the editor of the Bulletin, and for many of you in the room who might know, she never hesitated to encourage you to submit articles to her for publication. The club, like so many collecting groups, was naturally about camaraderie, formed around a shared love of American glass. It's obviously a lot more fun to geek out with other people who love what you love, right? This personal and very communal collecting activity, along with the more commercially driven dealers like McCurran and Knittel, became hugely influential in the formation of museum collections of American glass, with Corning and Yale's collections being respective examples. Here we see members of the club gathered in the auditorium at the old meeting house at Sturbridge Village during the club's summer trip. What do you notice about the people in this photograph? They're predominantly women, right? They're all white. They're all fairly middle-aged or older. It's probably pretty representative of the early collectors and scholars and dealers. Compare it with some of our current audiences who visit the Corning Museum. Our international tour groups, school children, retirees, emerging artists, avid collectors, and families. The ages of all of these visitors, their racial, their cultural, their educational and economic backgrounds, and the structure of their visits, whether they're guided on group tours or self-guided families and individuals, it's really varied. So how might these sorts of elements impact their engagement with glass, studied and highlighted by that formative group? It got me thinking about another aspect of the visitor experience, that of how we display and interpret our American glass collection. So if we go backwards in time again to those early exhibitions, like the 1929 Girl Scouts exhibition, take a look at the display. Or the very early study gallery at the Corning Museum of Glass, and we compare those case designs to our current installation of American glass. This is at the Corning Museum, which is now going on 20 years old. These approaches all reinforce a certain taxonomy that was established very early on in the 20th century. It typically favors a sort of chronology, then maybe manufacturer, and then a technical making, like all of this is pressed glass. As much as these cases hold, we show. Looking at this series of slides, it really struck me how much our collection and our display methods have pretty much been designed for specialists. Like the 4 bays of these American flasks from Helen McCurran's collection set up in Corning's study gallery. These are actually 3 deep, and the bottle collectors, who are uber specialists, even complain to me they can't see the best, the finest, the most valuable. Even the specialists don't like this. It's actually set up according to McCurran's classification system, which I didn't realize until I started working at the museum, even though I had visited for 15 years. So these visual opportunities to reflect on the collection are pretty potent, and they're really critical in formulating what kind of work is ahead of us. The goal here is not to eliminate the past classifications, but it's to expand the narrative surrounding these objects. And to do that, we really first have to delve into our existing collections and better understand them and how they came to be. That's why I showed you some of those past slides. Then we can identify better opportunities for growth. So we've been doing that work for the past year or so at the Corning Museum by undertaking a thorough collection survey. The entire curatorial department has done this. The Corning Museum of Glass has amassed nearly 50,000 glass objects since opening in 1951. In both 2013 and again recently in 2018, the collections and curatorial teams worked on a comprehensive collections assessment. These will continue to be reevaluated every 5 years. And currently, the survey is broken into the various curatorial departments, divided by curatorial expertise. So right now, we have an ancient and Islamic curator, the European curator, the American curator. We have a section focusing on Asian glass collections, science and technology, and modern and contemporary. Each of these areas in the collection survey goes through and identifies a general scope of the collection. We give some value to the collection. We identify its strengths and weaknesses. We develop a 5-year collecting strategy that helps guide our acquisition process. And then we assembled a series of appendices depending on what the department was. For the department, in the American department, I'm going to take you through and show you some of these in some fun new charts I created just for this lecture, including things like looking at who are our top makers and manufacturers represented in the collection. So all of these pretty bubbles represents any one source that represents 100 or more objects we have from the collection. So you can see that for anyone who accuses us of focusing on Tiffany a lot, we have very well representation of Steuben glass here. And you take a look at that. It's interesting. Other areas include that we look at place of manufacturer, which is a strong corollary to the maker. So if you take a look at place of manufacture, what do you notice? So the darker green represents more objects, and I hope you can see some of those subtle shades, with New York being very represented because Corning Museum of Glass is in New York, so we collect things from our own town and history. But you've got Pennsylvania and Massachusetts in there, and Ohio, sort of a soft green. Nothing from Texas, nothing from Utah, nothing from Florida. Who does that leave out of the story? Currently, we have less than a dozen objects attributed to Canada, Mexico, North America, or even South America. The museum has traditionally approached cataloging and interpretation of American glass from this view of place made rather than place used. That's the hierarchy in our database system, right at the top. Who's the manufacturer and where is it located? This cuts off a potentially rich and more diverse interpretation of what America even means, or whose stories are being told. In the collection survey, decided to put together a list of sources, whether gift or purchase, that represented over 100 objects in the collection. Let me go here first. It's interesting to see who pops up here. So we have represented over 1,600 different sources of either gifts or purchases that have come to us in the collection, which I think is amazingly diverse. I think that's a great thing. And what you see here is really about the top 20 sources. So very much represented from Louise Esterly and the McCurins, very well represented. And what I decided to do was actually take a look at this on a timeline instead to see what kind of trends evolved. So working on this, I was really interested in things that would impact. We had a terrible flood in Corning in 1972, so I kind of wanted to see, did we get a whole bunch of stuff after that? That didn't seem to be the case, driving it. But we have major purchases in 1950, 1955, and 1960 from the McCurins. and gifts of pressed glass from Louise Esterly come in 60 and 68. And major gifts, this is from Louise Esterly, major gifts of art glass in 1979, and an assortment of big gifts in 2003 that range from bottles to art glass to cut glass. There's a spike in 1975 from Corning Glassworks and Otto Hilbert and Steuben, all local. So not only are private collectors and dealers driving the formation of our collection, which is pretty young in 1975, but at CMOG, we also have overlaid the corporation as a major donor, which really drove our collection in certain ways early on. Another way of looking at trends was to consider the ratio of gifts versus purchases over time. Looking at this graph, you can see that the gifts are sort of the lighter green and the purchases are teal. There's a lot more purchasing of glass going on early in the museum's history with big spikes. Really, you can see it really tapers off today. It made sense that we were purchasing a lot early on. We were in our formative years in the 1950s and 60s and 70s. And after looking at this data in preparation for the lecture, I started to wonder if these spikes and valleys were unique to the Corning Museum, or were they reflecting broader trends in the museum world, in American glass scholarship and collecting, or maybe even larger cultural moments, like America celebrating its bicentennial in 1976. So to find that out, I had to call in some favors. So I put in some calls to some colleagues at museums across the country, and I asked them if they would be willing, or twisting their registrar's arm to be willing, to run some rough database numbers for me on their collections, hoping that that broader sense would give me a little more insight to what I was seeing on Corning's collection development over time. So this is the list of museums that I reached out to and their founding dates. So you can see Corning is really the infant in this room. And I was so delighted at the response I got. I was really nervous when I sent this out because I didn't want to burden anyone. It's a lot of work to do these sorts of things. All 14 museums responded to my request. So for those of you who are in the room who did that, thank you very much. And you can see that I just also want to preface with a bit of a caveat, a little bit of that McCurran caveat, a lot of caveats we've heard today, that what I'm about to show you is really rough data, and it was really just to get a sense of things. So all of the curators who sent me this data said, please take it with a grain, because our databases are all different from one another, and we need to work on our databases as well. So thank you for pointing that out, Kelly. And most of these museums are actually fine arts museums, which makes them a little bit different than the Corning Museum of Glass. The Corning Museum of Glass is a museum that's focused on the art, history, and science of a single material. I did try to ask museums that were spread across the country. I didn't want to just have that sort of northeast concentration the way we saw with the glass making. There's certainly some really important glass collections missing from this list, but again, this is just scratching the surface for what I think we can continue to do. So, the first thing was to define what I was looking for. So roughly, I just wanted to know how many American glass objects that are made before 1830 do you have in your collection compared to the rest of your glass collection? Not the overall collection, but the rest of your glass holdings. So what you're seeing here is that, and it's broken down by percentage, just to help compare apples to apples. How much, so the Bennington Museum, most of their glass is American glass. I hope you can see that. And the reason that the bars are a little darker means that, for instance, the Corning Museum has lots more stuff. So that's the difference in the gradation there. Next, I kind of wanted to know how much of the American glass was on display. And you can see these results include study galleries and open storage as they were reported to me. So all of this is as it was reported to me. So The Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Yale University Art Gallery have great open storage plans. So you can see they have a large percentage of their American glass on view, which is great. And then you can see it grading down. Just take a minute to digest. So we have about 40%, not bad. Next, I was curious to know how much of these American glass collections were developed in the first half of the 20th century, coinciding with those years of robust activity we talked about earlier. So it was very interesting to see the difference of what I got reported in on this. So I had suspected that a lot of museum collections had their collections donated early on. And you can see that some of those, either I didn't get the data back fully to calculate, or the Corning Museum of Glass was, I should have made this 1951 instead of 1950, and then we could have been in there as well. And I wanted to compare that to what was happening on the other end of the timeline, because I had a suspicion that museum collecting activity related to American glass has slowed down significantly in the 21st century. And that suspicion definitely proved true, as you see here. It's down to single digits in some cases. We also found that trend correlated to a decline in articles published on American glass. For example, in the past 20 years of the magazine Antiques, out of 26 articles that related to American glass, 10 have been about Louis Comfort Tiffany, and about 9 are about glass that predates 1900, just to give you a sense. I also went back to look at our gifts versus purchases and compared those with other museums. And you can see that very much so, large amounts of these collections are driven by gifts. So they're driven by, likely from the collector or the dealer end, although certainly from the museum side as well. I also asked a more informal question of the curators in my survey about public inquiries. And one curator interpreted that specifically. I was very interested to know if museums were getting public inquiries about American glass. We get a lot at the Corning Museum. And one curator interpreted that to mean specifically donations. And she articulated it well. She said, quote, "We frequently field offers of gifts of American glass, often late 19th and early 20th century collectibles, that we are not able to consider for the collection because the works duplicate areas we have in depth." Most of the museums I pulled, like I said before, are different in mission and scope from the Corning Museum of Glass. They're fine arts museums, not history or science museums. So sometimes that means the Corning Museum targets areas to collect in depth, but I can understand why art museums are not focused on that. As recently as 2010, the Corning Museum accepted a comprehensive collection of Pyrex, Pyrex that was made over a span of 100 years from the collection of Diane Williams, and it numbers in the thousands. Following the acquisition came an exhibition celebrating the 100th anniversary of Pyrex in 2015, and through that exhibition and that acquisition, we were able to unveil more glass-connected stories about women, about children's lives, and create personal connections that resonated with many of our visitors. I love this story. This woman came to a lecture I was giving at the Smithsonian on Steuben, and she came up to see the exhibition, and she was shocked and so delighted and surprised to see her mother featured there in the test kitchens. Her mother was a really seminal figure in the test kitchens for Pyrex, and it was a really wonderful moment. The focus on this exhibition and on this collecting wasn't on this as a product made by Corning Incorporated, a really innovative glass. It was on the consumer's viewpoint, on the user's viewpoint. And that made it really different, I think. The scale of this collection building has enormous impact, though, on an institution's resources. And it took our photography, registration, and collections team years to process all this material. This was a recent acquisition, so our standards for processing a record shot, cleaning the Pyrex, and database entry are really different now than they were 50 years ago. So the records for this are pretty good. Since so much of what museums acquired though, as we saw, has been prior to 2000, I also wanted to see how others were faring in the area of identification and classification in their databases. This chart shows collections with identified makers, so things that are attributed in the database. And I suspected that many museums were tackling what we are faced with at the Corning Museum. We're revisiting the basic foundational information on the collection's identity. It's not bad, but you can see everybody's pretty, go Toledo Museum of Art, yeah. But everybody else is pretty much in range, sort of 35 to 60%, has an attribution, and the rest is unidentified. So we were all right in line in that, largely speaking. Today, curators go through a very thorough process of acquisition documentation when something new comes into the collection. So glass acquired in the last 20 years will probably have way more complete database records. But how do we possibly go back and reevaluate thousands of pieces of glass? I mean, thousands of pieces of glass in the Corning Museum collection, plus all of these other collections in total. Well, there's actually already some informal methodology at work to that. So I thought I'd share one recent example with you. In his July 2018 article in the publication Antique Bottle and Glass Collector Bob Corin walks us through his discovery of some incorrect, quote, rib counts on optic molded blown glass attributed to Zanesville and Mantua, Ohio factories. And we see him here. He's at the Corning Museum of Glass with our conservator, Steve Koob. And he points out that these rib counts were incorrectly published in both American Glass and in 200 Years of Blown Glass. So while and he was astonished by that, how could it possibly be the McCurrins were wrong? While I think that we should account for attributions of glass to specific factories, probably by more than just rib counting, what Bob's article revealed was just how easily this canon, this Bible of the McCurrins has been accepted as 100% fact from the get-go over time. These objects were acquired in 1955, and Steve Koob pulled the original catalog cards, which we have. So the original catalog cards revealed that Axel von Saldern, one of the museum's first curators, simply copied the McCurrins, and thus has been ever since in the collection that way. So if a re-examination of the material occurred, it was certainly never updated in our official records. Like many collectors, Bob started with the McCurrin books and then worked to build his knowledge. And for me, this brought up a big question. These were some of the objects you can see on that he was evaluating. The big question for me was, who has access to these collections in museums? And how are we at the museum managing resources to work with scholars and collectors on updating this information as it comes to light? It often takes more than one visit or observation to verify these types of changes. And it's not a secret that an investment of resources can be extremely challenging for curatorial and collection staff to work with in their busy schedules. So when I pulled this slide, the other thing I said to myself was, how do we not have better photographs of these cover shots, of these cover glass pieces? How do we not have great photos of these materials? And that brought up one last question I brought to the table for the other museums, was how much of your collection is photographed? And this slide really shows that museums have done fabulous at documenting record shots, at least, if not really great photography, that account for their collections. So kudos to all the museums there. However, I would also say that at least at the Corning Museum of Glass, many of these early acquisitions still need really great updated photography. So by supporting a campaign to capture detailed images, it would really help foster conversations and comparisons and make them accessible remotely to scholars, dealers, and collectors for comparison. So the more detailed photographs, we don't have to manage the on-site as much, and so that can help forward a navigation of more information coming into the system. So I also think that photography can really transform and inspire and potentially captivate new audiences. And I think the new publications that have come out recently in 2017 at the Chrysler Museum of Art, and of course this year's Yale University Art Gallery catalog have really demonstrated this really beautiful, captivating material and hopefully generated some renewed interest in the collections. Closely related to publications, though, are special exhibitions. And I didn't pull the other museums. I thought that was going to be too onerous on the timeline I was working with. But I will share with you a list of Corning's recent collection survey of all of our past exhibitions related to American glass. You can see there that Jane, obviously with her long tenure, is the dominant curator. Got one on the book so far. And a lot of these are pressed glass, American historical flasks. And one thing I haven't done yet is look at spikes in the collection building related to when these exhibitions happen, which is one thing I would suspect. But there's sort of a tapering off of American exhibitions after 2000. There's not any really large ones except the Mount Washington exhibition there. So when I pulled this, exhibitions, I think, are one of the major avenues for justifying resources to revisit the basic information in these focused areas of the collection. And what this showed me was pockets where we haven't spent time at the Corning Museum of Glass with a focused interest. And what the special exhibitions can do is really help support new photography, and they can also account for the most precious resource of all, which is time for research. That's what happened back in 2015 when the Corning Museum of Glass did some digging on glass related to an exhibition project on the colonial revival in America that was being researched at the time. It provided us with a great excuse to take a look at our collection, and particularly some of the earliest acquisitions from the McCurrins. So we spent some time combing through the publications related to that 1929 Girl Scouts exhibition. There are related publications, which made it a lot easier. And we were able to identify specific objects now in our collection, and this exhibition history had not been documented in our database, and now it is. We also took the opportunity to re-photograph these pieces, thinking that they might go out on loan or be included in the exhibition's catalog. And here you can see we've really specifically set them up to mirror those period photographs. Related to research on an exhibition's provenance is the publication, scientific examination, and archaeological histories surrounding objects. In working on this lecture, I had a lot of fun reviewing some correspondence between that archaeologist, Harry Hall White, and George McCurrin. And I was really interested in White's early archaeological explorations around the country and how they informed early classification. And this example caught my eye since it reveals information on how the dealer, George McCurrin, was trying to sell a piece of amylon glass to museums. Here you can read it, potentially the Detroit Museum. And to summarize for you, McCurrin asks Harry Hall White for his confidential opinion on selling this glass for the hefty sum of $4,000, potentially to the Detroit Museum. But if not Detroit, perhaps another museum. In all honesty, as I was reading this, it didn't occur to me immediately which amylon glass he was referring to, shame on me, because that piece ended up being in Corning's collection. So I was in the library and I was reading this and I just typed in the Detroit Museum, just see what popped up. Nothing popped up on their online catalog, but what did appear was this article in Scientific Monthly from 1952, with the tumbler still listed in McCurrin's collection. So then I immediately said, this is in Corning's collection, clearly, and there it is. However, that publication of Scientific Monthly was really interesting. It was taking a scientific analysis of that amylon glass and amylon glasses, but it had not been recorded in our database associated with this piece. And what that was just scratching the surface of provenance work that needs to be done on American glass, not just on our collection, but across the museums I polled. That was generally a resounding bit of information. Most of my colleagues articulated that provenance histories are pretty meager in the database. This is a big area where we have some work to do. Reassessment of archival materials and the changing landscape of digital information has opened up a lot of new avenues for research, but especially for provenance. So that serendipitous article I found with some really designated, dedicated digging around, provenance histories of a lot of pieces of American glass can be pinned down. And I'll share another tidbit of my conversation with Dwight Lamond with you. Knowing the collections is the curator's primary job. That's what he told me, that's what he told Jane. And I definitely failed on this one, I admit it. I should have known that. I should have known that was REM along Tumblr. And I think that Dwight is right. I think that curators should have a firm grasp on their collections. But as I told him, I also know very well that curators have a lot of competing demands on their time, and that aspects of museum and curatorial work can be very challenging, particularly as we're working on the narrative and interpretive outward-facing stories rather than on the back end of collection development like what I've been talking about. So at the same time I was putting these slides together and ruminating on these questions, an article appeared earlier this month in the New York Times that I thought was so timely. I don't know, sounds like some of you have read it, perhaps. The reporter, Robin Pogrobin, probed current issues of collection development and long-term stewardship in museums. I was struck by the comment by James Rondeau, who's the director of the Art Institute of Chicago, who remarked that in the past, quote, museums were accepting with less criticality when collections were smaller. We took 12 when we might not have even taken 1. And that statement really echoed what I was discovering to be the case with American glass collections at the various museums I was talking with. Except we haven't been talking about 12 paintings. We've been talking about 1,000 pressed goblets, or 4,000 pieces of Pyrex, or 4 cases full of mold-blown flasks. So that's a lot more material. I also saw that glass popped up not once, but twice in this article. So my radar was way up. And I don't know if it was because I've been working on this lecture, but there's just been a number of things like this that have seemed really timely, and talking about this all seems really timely. So what we have to do, what all of this calls for, is a dedicated collaborative effort to continue shifting staff activities to the stewardship and the interpretation of our existing collections, rather than actively soliciting more of these large gifts of American glass. Museums are slowly but visibly undergoing transformations and expanding to a more diverse and inclusive model, from board composition to curatorial staff to the collections themselves. Our work isn't simply about passing along information published 80 years ago from one generation to the next. Rather, it's addressing how generational changes in our research methods, our museum and collecting practices, and ultimately our broader cultural movements inform and shape our understanding of this material. The canon of American glass interpretation and approach to collecting has not changed much over the course of the 20th century. American glass collections need to be re-examined. They need to be photographed anew. They need to be cataloged and published. They need to be sorted and exhibited. Out of this effort, we can naturally expand our interpretive missions, and we can create a more diverse narrative about American glass by studying our collections more. There is much more work to do, and we are likely only going to get there by doing it collaboratively. Most of the curators and registrars that I requested information from and who were not able to be here asked that I circle back to them to share the gathered information. I hadn't realized I was creating the cohort, the beginnings of it. and that was really wonderful and heartening. I also realized pretty quickly that with more time and planning and perhaps a more skilled survey question asker, all of us can engage in a more formalized, publishable assessment and champion each other's efforts in this endeavor. Not everybody has the resources or the focus of the Corning Museum of Glass on glass. So we think about how can we help? How can we lead this? And maybe I don't have to know everything about the museum's collection. Maybe my job is to inspire all of you to learn alongside with me. Don't you think it's about time? Thank you.